Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name's Sarah Watson, and I'm one of the Deputy SEND leads for the North region. So thanks for joining today for our session on supporting learners with low incidence SEND needs. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, or if you've got any questions for our speakers once we start, you can put those in the Q&A box or in the chat and we'll answer them. We'll be putting some links in the chat as we go along. So if you've joined us before, you'll be aware that this is a webinar, so we won't be able to see your videos or anything, so all of the engagement is in the chat. So we've got 39 participants, 40, so it's just ticking up, so we've got a few more people joining us, so we'll make a start with the introductions. Okay, so this session is all about learners with low incidence SEND, and I'll just go over the session objectives that we've got today. Really raising awareness and understanding about low incidence needs, the prevalence of low incidence needs and common misconceptions. Now that is a huge session objective, so we're probably not going to cover all of it, but we're going to try. We're also going to cover assistive technology for young people with low incidence needs. And we're going to think about the importance of student voice and preferences. So those are our big objectives, but also this session is to really introduce you to low incidence needs and that expert input. So where to go to if you've got a student that you're working with and you need that advice, support and guidance. So we've got some fantastic experienced speakers with us today. We've got Jane Sharp, who's going to talk about vision impairment, Hannah Brown, who's going to share with us some case studies from physical disability, and Teresa Quayle, who's going to be talking about deaf learners. And they're representing VIEW, PDNet and BATOD, and they'll introduce their organisation and talk a bit more about how to find out some more training, more information and where to go to get support. So we're really looking at low incidence SEND support from an expert input point of view. I'm just going to do a short introduction about the prevalence of low incidence needs and what the data looks like. If you haven't heard already, and I'm sure you have if you're a member of Whole School SEND in the network, we've launched a teacher handbook all about SEND support strategies, teaching strategies, and quite detailed information on specific needs. So if you haven't already looked at that, I'd recommend downloading it because there's some fantastic sections. It's 180 pages, but it's all hyperlinked and we'll be directing you to some of the sections relevant to this session today. Okay, so we're going to make a start with a simple question. What is low incidence SEND? So when we look at the four broad areas of need, cognition and learning, social, emotional, mental health, cognition and communication, interaction, and then sensory and physical. Low incidence SEND is that sensory and physical category. So you can see there we're talking about roughly 6% of the special needs population within our schools. So we are talking about low numbers, and that's where the kind of tagline low incidence SEND comes from. Some colleagues in other local authorities that I work with refer to it as LI SEND, low incidence SEND, and some local authorities have LINT teams, low incident needs teams, and it is just because we've got very small numbers there, only 6%. Okay, oh, I've skipped ahead. So then when we look at the sensory and physical category, it can be broken down into vision impairment, hearing impairment, multi-sensory impairment and physical disability, and totaling together that gives us the 6% of students. Now these categories, when we talk about hearing impairment, visual impairment, multi-sensory and physical disability, are the categories that SENCOs fill in when they do their census. So we've just had a census back in January, and those are the codes that you'll have probably on your school information system. It is worth considering and reflecting on the terms used within your setting, because some parents, some children and young people don't really want to be referred to as having an impairment. I know Teresa will talk about this later on, about the importance of the word deaf rather than looking at hearing impairment. Sensory needs are sometimes used, so it's just worth considering on the terminology you use within your setting. Just because it's on the census and that's the information report doesn't mean that you have to use those categories when referring to the students, and maybe speaking to parents and young people and getting their input on how they'd like their need to be discussed, because quite rightly some students don't want to use the word impairment, which I fully understand and support. Okay, so that was just a little introduction to low incidence needs and then the prevalence. In terms of numbers, if we combine all of the totals, it's just over 77,000 within England. So many children who have low incidence SEND might also have a different primary need. So they may have a learning disability or a medical need, and then they also may have a vision impairment or multi-sensory impairment. So the numbers are quite hard to work out exactly. Because we're dealing with such low numbers, it means that some settings might only have 1, 2, maybe they don't have any learners with low incidence SEND, and then it becomes really difficult for the SENCO, for the teaching staff, to know exactly how to support that student. So this session is really introducing where do you go to get that support, advice, that expert input. So moving on, we're going to start with our first expert. I'm delighted to introduce Jane Sharp. So Jane has been a QTVI for 20 years, and she's had a lot of experience in resource provisions and working as a PERI teacher, going out and visiting schools, mainstream and special. And Jane is currently the chair of VIEW, so a wealth of experience and expertise. And Jane, I'll move on to your first slide now.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. It's really lovely to be here today, and I'm so pleased that everybody has come along to learn a bit more about vision impairment. So as Sarah says, I'm a qualified teacher of the visually impaired, so I'll be using the term QTVI because that's a bit of a mouthful, the whole thing, most of the way through this presentation. If you want any more information about VIEW, there is a link in the handout, but the website is basically VIEW Web if you search for it. So in this session, I'm aiming to shine a light on some of the mysteries around vision impairment. I'll outline the support available to schools and finally consider the potential of technology. As we've heard, the next slide, please, Sarah. I'm going to have to try and remember that. As we've heard, there'll be a small number of learners in most schools that we know have vision impairment. In reality, though, there'll be more, as not all meet the criteria to be included in the statistics. Added to that, vision screening at age 4 to 5 doesn't pick up some issues, for example, eye movement difficulties, or where the problem lies with the brain's processing of visual information. That's cerebral vision impairment, or CVI for short. Therefore, a small but significant number of learners will remain under the radar. They'll appear to be managing or labelled as inattentive, lazy, or reluctant readers. I've put a link in the handout to a short YouTube video which takes a look at how some undiagnosed vision difficulties can impact on classroom activities. We all want these children to thrive with or without a diagnosis, and to this end we can put in some fairly straightforward adjustments to make our classrooms and lessons vision friendly. The list in the teacher handbook SEND includes having a well-lit classroom without glare, speaking clearly and using learners' names. For example, when inviting answers, you might say, "Yes, Summer, what do you think?" rather than just pointing, nodding, or looking over. Verbalising anything on the board and providing curriculum materials in an accessible format. I'd suggest that you use clear print format for all curriculum materials as standard, as this will help all learners, not just those with reduced vision. And it can be easily adapted for those with individual requirements. I've put a link to more detailed information in the handout, but in summary, clear print uses an easy to read font with a text size of N12 minimum, but preferably N14. The text contrasts well with the background, the layout is logical, and graphics are clear and or have captions describing the key features. I'll just take a moment here to address the common misconception that blowing things up on the photocopier makes them accessible. This is rarely as helpful as you might think, because firstly, enlarging to A3 introduces an additional challenge, particularly for learners with restricted visual fields or uncontrolled eye movements, that of scanning and searching over a larger area. On top of that, when something's been photocopied multiple times, the quality of the image suffers, the text will look grainier and contrast is reduced, especially if the background takes on a grey hue. And of course, if the layout was complex and challenging to navigate in the original, this will remain the case for the enlarged copy. Learners with vision impairment need resources reformatted into an accessible format, not resources that have been enlarged on the photocopier. Next slide, please. If someone has visual difficulties that can't be corrected by glasses, they're defined as having vision impairment. So it might seem confusing if they still wear glasses. However, it's common to have a refractive error alongside. Glasses can correct short sight or long sight and help in other ways too, for example, by reducing visual fatigue. However, for a learner with vision impairment, while glasses may improve their vision, they can't fully correct it. It can be frustrating when students have glasses but don't wear them. Neve in year 10 told me, I don't wear them because they don't do anything. She couldn't see any better with them on, and while they stopped her getting headaches as frequently, she wasn't prepared to put up with them in the moment for any future benefit. I always think that if glasses improve vision significantly and fit comfortably, learners will wear them. So if they're choosing not to, then referring back to the optician is a good first step to find out why. Next slide, please. I'm often asked, what can they see? Despite being a QTVI, this is a question I can rarely answer unless the answer is nothing at all or just light and dark. When we're trying to understand what others see, we naturally use what we can see as a baseline. However, this can lead to misunderstandings, as in the following scenario. Can you see that on the board, Charlie? Yes, Charlie said, when his teacher asked him. Minutes later, he was staring intently, screwing up his eyes, desperately trying to read the population of India. Eventually, he gave up, and for the rest of the activity, copied all his answers from his neighbour. Asking, can you see that, doesn't always help, as you and the learner are interpreting the question differently. You're asking, can you see it in the level of detail needed to do the task, and can you maintain that focus for the necessary length of time? The learner's answering, can you see there's something on the board or on the worksheet? Or say yes, not wanting to make a fuss and hoping that the information they need can be got from listening or by looking over their neighbour's shoulder. Observation is a much more reliable way of getting the feedback you need. Do they copy numbers accurately from the board? Are they copying from the person sat next to them? Are they missing details? Do they hunch over the desk? Do they work slowly and tire easily? The signs will be there if they aren't accessing information comfortably or fully. If you've worked with one learner with vision impairment, you'd hope that you could use the same strategies with another. However, this is not always the case, as different eye conditions affect different aspects of vision, so the adjustments needed for individual learners will vary sometimes greatly. If peripheral vision is affected more than central vision, accessing worksheets might not be a major problem, but PE activities might need adapting, and moving around school safely and confidently might be an issue. If a learner is extremely light sensitive, they'll need lighting in the classroom to be dialed down, whereas a learner with a different eye condition might need a high level of illumination to be able to see anything at all. Best not to put these two in the same class. Just to make things even more complex, it's worth noting that most learners with vision impairment will have more than one aspect of their vision affected. I've put a link in the handout to a video by Thomas Pocklington Trust that simulates some common eye conditions. It's well worth a look to get an idea of what typical scenes in a school might look like to learners with different types of vision impairment. And I've just taken a couple of stills from that video on the slide to show a classroom through possibly nystagmus and through retinitis pigmentosa, two very different eye conditions. So let's look at some of the everyday challenges presented by some different conditions. Katie struggled every day to find a bag in the bag store after lunch. The deputy head justified not allowing her to take her bag into the dining room with, "I've seen her reading a text on her phone, so she can easily find a bag." He'd not realised that Katie's peripheral vision was so restricted that she could only see a small area straight in front of her with any clarity, tunnel vision in other words. So reading text on her phone, especially because her motivation was high and it only required momentary effort, was doable, but scanning the bag pile was impossible. Some eye conditions, particularly those where the movement of the eyes is affected, can make maintaining a focus on detail very effortful, leading to fatigue and headaches. So it's not that a learner can't see whatever it is they need to see, but they can't sustain seeing it. Isaac describes reading standard print books. "I can see the writing, but it's hard to look at. I get frustrated because it's slow to read and I get tired." Isaac has a condition called nystagmus, which often accompanies other eye conditions. His eyes move constantly, uncontrollably. The movement, and therefore his vision, is worse when he's tired, stressed or unwell, so it varies even over the course of the school day. His teachers struggle with this inconsistency, but the key here, as it is when working with any learner with fluctuating vision, is to prepare for when vision's at its worst. Motivation is also a factor affecting functional vision. Functional vision being how well the eyes and visual system work in everyday situations, rather than the level of vision measured under clinical conditions. Cody illustrates this perfectly. "PE is my favourite lesson. I like rugby best. It's hard to pass the ball, but I want to do it." Cody has double vision all the time. So we can see how passing a ball accurately in a game moving at pace is demanding for him. His motivation is high though, so he overcomes the barrier. He also struggles with, in his words, small worksheets. His motivation in the classroom isn't as high, so he switches off when he has to put in more effort than his sighted peers. The key to getting Cody to engage is to level the playing field by providing him with less visually demanding resources. And I've put an example on the slide of, it's actually a GCSE exam question, and then that same question, well, the diagram for it anyway, reformatted. It's much easier to see. Lastly, the functional vision of someone with CVI can be affected by a wide range of factors, a major one being the complexity of the environment. For example, a learner sat with an unobstructed view of the board may be able to copy a single item on it if the teacher pauses speaking to give them time to do so. The same learner may only see a blurred image if the visual scene is crowded by other students in front of them, if the teacher continues talking whilst they're writing, and if they have to pick out what to copy from other content on the board. The competing demands from so much information to process reduces functional vision. Cerebral vision impairment is a very complex topic, so I've put a link in the handout to a clear introduction for anyone who'd like to learn more. Next slide, please. We've considered a few cases that illustrate wide variations in the needs of learners. So how can educators know what strategies to put in place for an individual? Local authorities have a statutory duty to carry out an initial assessment of any child or young person identified with vision impairment. So most employ at least one QTVI. QTVIs are qualified to assess functional vision in order to advise settings on how to meet a learner's needs. Fairly standard recommendations will refer to the seating position in class, the format of learning materials, any assistive technology that will be beneficial, and exam access arrangements, as well as safety considerations. To support schools to implement their recommendations, QTVIs can provide training for staff, for example on VI awareness, or for the production of large print resources. And they can deliver specialist interventions to learners, such as for the use of assistive technology. Contact details for VI educational support services are on local authorities' websites as part of the local offer. The RNIB's Children, Young People and Families team also has a list, and I've put their contact details in the handout, along with some national VI organisations that offer training courses and CPD events. Next slide, please. I'd like you to meet Grace. Grace's vision deteriorated rapidly in years 9 and 10. She rebelled against being provided with a reader scribe because she wanted to continue participating fully in her own learning. School and the VI team worked closely together to personalise Grace's curriculum to include specialist teaching for Braille, assistive technology, mobility, etc. By the time she started sixth form, she was using a white cane to move around school independently and no longer needed in-class support, although a lot of work was going on behind the scenes to put her resources into Braille or to make them suitable to access using a screen reader. She's now excelling at university and has already had 2 volumes of poetry published. The aim is always for learners with VI to, over time, depend less and less on adults to provide access to learning for them by developing skills to use specialist technology and the continually improving assistive technology features of mainstream devices. Introducing the use of technology early on makes it a normal way of working and more likely to be maintained and extended as time goes on. For younger learners, having a tablet to take photos of pictures in books so they can zoom in to study them is a great way in. Sometimes bringing in the use of technology later can be difficult. There's often resistance to using any equipment that's different to what others are using. And moving to a new way of working will usually involve an initial, albeit temporary, increase in effort and drop in work rate. The temptation to revert to previous strategies can be considerable, especially if the learner has developed a degree of learned helplessness. Let's consider being issued with a laptop or tablet to mirror what's on the smartboard. A fantastic solution, but it's not as simple as just giving the student the tech and they're up and running. They now have to carry that device around all day and be responsible for keeping it charged, which won't be a necessary welcome development for some. They may lack confidence with an unfamiliar device. They may find it difficult to use if the visual settings haven't been optimised for them, or if they've not been shown how to use the screen mirroring software. Students are more likely to embrace a new way of working that gives them independence when the right support and training are in place, both for them and the staff working with them. And the QTVI should be able to facilitate this. Next slide, please. There's a wide range of technology solutions out there, but in my view, the best tech for an individual is the tech they'll use. I like the iPad because it's easier to carry around. The laptop doesn't fit in my bag. This was one of a number of hints that a Year 10 student gave during a tech assessment. In preparation for Key Stage 4, we were looking at ways to reduce his reliance on adult support and to enable him to produce work that he could read back in order to edit it, as he couldn't read his own writing. It turned out the school had made a laptop available, but he was finding excuses not to use it, whereas he seemed enthusiastic about the iPad. So we went with that, and it was a great success. He's now in the second year of a graphic design course at college and planning to go on to university. Of course, for graphic design, he's moved on to using a PC. Looking back, I wonder whether if we'd pushed him to use a laptop, which in theory would have been the better device, he would have continued to reject it and then not using any tech at all, whether he would have had the skills he needed to go on to be successful and independent at college. Not all learners reject the introduction of technology later on. Some might agree to just use it for homework, which is better than nothing, and might lead to wider use later. And others, like Maddie, embrace it fully if it solves the problem for them. I can at least do some of the work in cover lessons now instead of just sitting there bored for an hour. Maddie used large print resources, so was unable to access the photo-reduced copies of pages from revision guides or textbooks that were handed out in cover lessons. She was given an iPad and shown how to use a specialist app to access text and another app to magnify images. This setup wasn't equivalent to having resources reformatted, but it did at least improve her level of access to lessons that previously she couldn't access at all. As well as that, having these tools in the toolkit is good preparation for independent living, as not all information in the wider world is available in accessible formats. While we're on the subject of technology, it's worth noting that accessible doesn't always mean usable. Virtual learning environments illustrate this point well. Sasha moved to college where homework was posted on Teams. She told me that she could never find what she was supposed to do because there was so much on the screen. The VLE was technically accessible in that you can zoom in and text-to-speech works, that kind of thing. But for her, the complex interface was a barrier. The problem was easily solved though, where it was directly emailed to her instead of putting it on Teams. As mentioned earlier, one aspect of a QTVI's role, along with mobility officers, is to teach specialist skills. They'll often introduce these in withdrawal sessions before learners begin to embed them into their normal way of working. So what are pupils learning when they're missing mainstream lessons? Well, they might be learning how to use assistive technology. They might be learning how to chop vegetables safely. They might be developing their listening skills. The list goes on. But they'll bring these skills back to the classroom to be able to access the mainstream curriculum more fully and with a higher degree of independence. They'll also be better prepared to access continuing education, employment, and independent living after school. For a comprehensive list of specialist skills that are needed by learners with vision impairment, but are not generally part of the mainstream curriculum, take a look at the new curriculum framework for children and young people with vision impairment. Following its launch on 15th of March, I expect it to be on the RNIB and VIEW websites, amongst others. Next slide, please. To sum up, we've seen that embedding some basic adjustments into everyday practice can enhance access to the curriculum for many learners, including those with visual difficulties. The QTVI will recommend specific adjustments for those diagnosed with vision impairment and can support, train, and in some cases work alongside staff in schools to implement these. Assistive technology is a key tool for enabling learners to gradually work towards independence in order to access continuing education and employment, as well as live independently. Final slide, please. Thank you very much for finding the time at the end of the school day to come along and find out more about vision impairment. I look forward to answering any questions you may have towards the end of the session.